Well, good evening, or if you're joining us from elsewhere in the world, perhaps good afternoon or good morning. Welcome to Reading Architecture Writing, which is a lecture series here at Kyoto University in which authors will introduce their new books, usually but not always on topics related to Japanese architecture and urbanism. So it's a great pleasure tonight to introduce the French architect François Blanciak, who's currently an associate professor at the National University of Singapore. He has a long and varied career as a practitioner, having worked for Peter Eisenman in New York, for OMA in Hong Kong, for Plot in Copenhagen, and for Frank Gehry in Los Angeles before doing postgraduate studies at the University of Tokyo, where he received his PhD. While studying in Tokyo, he published his first book, which is a bestseller titled Sightless, 1001 Building Forms. It's basically a taxonomy of imaginary experimental shapes, iconic forms that might be turned into architecture, and no doubt has influenced many student projects in the subsequent years, for better or for worse. So his most recent book, which he'll be publishing tonight, is titled Tokyoids, the Robotic Face of Architecture. It's published by the MIT Press this year. It comprises a collection of photos of Tokyo buildings in which Francois has discerned the image of a face and likened these faces to robots. So these are accompanied by a fascinating history of face imagery in architecture, ranging from 18th century architectural theory in France to modern Japanese popular culture, with digressions into the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and the impact of real robots in architectural education and building construction. So whatever else this book might be, it's certainly very entertaining, and I'm sure this lecture will be too. So over to you, Francois.
Thank you for welcoming me at the University of Kyoto. I must say that this is a city that I don't know very much. Actually, I can say safely that I don't know Kyoto, or at least not as much as I know Tokyo. And at Tokyo, so I find myself in a kind of strange situation in the sense that I'm cognizant of Tokyo and its architecture, and in a sense, like Tokyo is more associated with the new, right? And Kyoto is more associated with the old. But in a sense, like everything in Kyoto feels very new to me because I've never seen that before. So today, as it's been said, I will introduce some of the content of my new book, Tokyoids. I'm happy to see that there's a cover on the table, it's a copy on the table, so which has just been published back in September this year, and this focuses on the notion of robotic aesthetics and the relation of robotic aesthetics to architecture. So first, I'm going to explain why I decided to focus on robotic aesthetics in this particular context. I talk about it because robots have literally invaded architecture schools over the course of the last 15 years. The most, I think, striking change in the visual environment of architecture schools appears indeed to have been the insertion of robots in their midst. We have entire departments that have been reconfigured to accommodate these robots. Some doors have been enlarged, some rooms have been added, some basements have been reappropriated to accommodate these newcomers. And these robots are usually prominently showcased, but they are seldom used. Prominently showcased, especially in marketing materials, as you've probably seen. And this, in my view, justifies the focus on their aesthetic properties, because it seems to be the very focus. So everything happens, in a sense, as if these devices, these robots, represented, in a sense, the new symbolic image of architectural education, right? The robot has become, in a sense, the contemporary equivalent to the ionic column, right? Everything happens as if a school that an architecture school that doesn't have a robot isn't, in a sense, like an architecture school, right? How could it be? So it's a phenomenon that I think is probably most visible in American and European architecture schools, but also in Australia, where I shot this particular picture. And surprisingly, Japanese architectural academia has, as far as I know, very much resisted this trend. And this is, I think, in a sense, a good thing. And it has done so, I think, somewhat paradoxically and surprisingly, given the role that Japan has played and keeps playing in the development of robots, right? We're talking about a country whose history is very tied to the history of the robot, which is why I wanted to make this connection with Japan and with Tokyo in particular. So arguably, the mechanical arms that are inherited from the automotive industry that are used in architecture schools challenge our conventional conception of robotic form. Unlike the toy robots that sprung up in post-war Japan, their faces has been excised, right? They don't have a face. But my book argues that the robotic face is precisely what fundamentally relates robotics to architecture. So robots have been the object of many recent publications expressing either fear or enthusiasm for them. But the common focus of these studies lies in what can be achieved through automation. And I think that what differentiates my study is its focus on the very appearance of robotic devices and on the robotic face more specifically. And the reason why I focus on the face is because the face can be understood as a universal locus of aesthetic concern, right? We're all concerned with what our faces look like, and architects very much so. And also for the role, I'm interested in the face for the role it has played in the development of the visual arts, right? And also its capital importance in human interaction now makes it a primary target of automation technology, right? You can see this with the face scanning and its political implications and so on. So the first chapter of this book, that's the contents page, is called Diagram and Face, and it's by far the longest and most theoretical one. It aims to put the robotic face into historical perspective. So in lieu of a literature review, it takes the form of what I call a portrait review, following the hypothesis that to each architectural era corresponds a specific way of imposing a geometric order onto the depiction of a human face, right? So what I try to do is, in essence, to rewrite history of architecture without showing any buildings. That's ambitious, and focusing instead on how the manner of representing the face can epitomize the design ethos of each architectural style. So what I'm trying to prove is that the design techniques or methodologies that characterize a given architectural era can be summarized or symbolized by one particular diagram of a face, which is then reversed to the robotic insofar as it's an idealized or a geometricized a reconstruction of human form. So in this chapter, I go through a number of works, you can see here, by Villard de Honcourt, Francesco Di Giorgio, Albrecht Dürer, Jean-Jacques Lequeux, some work by Schlemmer, Le Corbusier, Isozaki, and so on, to basically sustain this argument. And this part is not intended to focus on one particular movement, as historical studies usually do, but on the diachronic evolution of one specific type of drawing, as you can see. Everything okay? So the goal of this study is twofold. It aims to stress the preponderance of the human face as some sort of catalyst of architectural dogmas, and also to demonstrate how these constructions have triggered the emergence of a properly robotic aesthetic. So what I'm trying to show is in this first chapter is that robotic aesthetics, if not the image of the robot itself, originated from the field of architectural theory long before the rise of robotics as a modern science. So this is a very a theoretical argument. And in fact, this is not what I will present today. In order to make this lecture more understandable or less wakarinikui, in this context, I will go through a couple of chapters that relate to things that you should be more familiar with, and maybe some of you are actually more familiar than I am myself. These chapters come from the main body of the book, which is organized in chapters that can be read completely independently and which display this series of photographs that I shot during my time in Tokyo, such as this one. So these photographs, again, try to grasp the robotic aesthetic of architecture, but this time in real space, in the real space of Tokyo. And they implicitly defend the notion of figuration over the domineering forces of abstraction in architecture. It's a photographic survey that aims to shed light on a hitherto under-theorized kind of building, which is manifestly recurrent in the built environment of Tokyo, and which exudes robotic aesthetics through this kind of schematic resemblance with the human face. So it kind of taps into this sort of serendipitous mixes between architecture and infrastructure that makes Tokyo so particular. So what is intended, in a sense, is a sort of a tabula rasa on the notion of architectural expression, searching for universally recognizable artistic qualities in what I call a nexus between building and facial morphologies that almost automatically evokes the robotic. And the chapters then are named after the emotions that the buildings they contain convey, such as awe here, wrath, mirth, pain, angst, and finally hunger, in the manner of physiognomic treatises of the past, such as those of Charles Lebrun, right in the 17th century. And this classification, according to moods, aims to reflect then not only the specific expressive qualities of each of these buildings, but also in more general terms, feelings that currently I think affect the architectural world and which are in turn reflected in the tone of the text. So I invite you to read it. These main chapters all tackle in one way or another the relationship between architecture, technology, and Japan. And the two chapters I'm going to go through with you tonight to read are called Mirth and Pain. So I handpicked these two as they are the ones that deal probably most explicitly with Japan proper. The first one, Mirth, tries to draw a parallel between the notion of caractère in French 18th century architectural theory and that of kyarakutā in Japanese contemporary popular culture. And the other one looks at a fundamental connection, which I try to establish between robotic form and the structure of the Japanese language. So the photographs that I will show on the screen are the photographs that show up in the book. And I have left them in their order of appearance. So they will be displayed where they happen to be displayed in the book. And I've also added a number of images that do not appear in the book, and also some quotes which refer to the points that I make in the text to make it more understandable. Okay, so let's start with Mirth. And it starts with this epigraph from the philosopher Henri Bergson, which goes that he says that the diversion of life towards mechanism is the real cause of laughter. So you will see that the beginning of the chapters are a bit literary, a bit novelistic. That's something that we aim to do, or I aim to do, in order to basically invite the reader into the chapter. So let's start. So slithering through the twists and turns of the Yurikamo Main Line, the automated monorail that flanks Tokyo Bay, One is smoothly elevated off the ground and brought for a short moment face to face with a peculiar thing. This one. Despite being 8-story high and resolutely bulky, the creature feels strangely familiar and friendly. Its upper part features 2 arched openings, which sharply contrast with its beige complexion and delineate a mischievous green. Exposing a wide row of kid-like windows with a twinkle in its eye, it is visibly having a good time, right? Though entirely defined by straight lines and circular lines, the message its countenance conveys takes over that of the billboard come speech bubble, which lies above its head. As the train slides away, the wandering mind, emerging from a transit-induced torpor, might well ask, what makes you laugh, weird thing? Are you a piece of corporate architecture or a fugitive manga character? And these are, I think, legitimate questions. Consider the similarity between the words caractère, character, and kyarakutā. So if there's little that points at first glance to any link between Japanese architecture's rather stern look, right, and the exuberant joviality of much of Japan's pop culture output, the terms used to describe both categories of artifacts, as you can see, share the same root. The notion of caractère emerges as a domineering concept in 18th century French architectural theory, evoking the capacity of an edifice to reveal either its function or the status of its occupants, or even emotions through its form, through the form of the building. And the instigator of this trend is an architect called Germain Beaufranc, or rather a theorist. And he argued in his dissertation sur ce qu'on appelle le bon goût en architecture, so dissertation on what we call good taste in architecture of 1745, for the truthful employment of ornamentation as a means, basically, to signify the program. So what he tried to do is to basically assign functionality to the figurative component of architecture, right? The ornament. And he said a building must be smiling to those upon which it must impress joy, and serious and sad to those upon which it must impress sorrow. And another theorist called Nicolas Le Camus de Mézières refined this doctrine by contending that these affections can be ascribed by way of proportions rather than ornaments. And his writings notably make a direct reference to the physiognomical work of Charles Lebrun, which I mentioned before, who looked at the facial expression of passions and also drew a parallel with the animal form. Le Camus de Mézières even quotes Lebrun's observation that the face of feral beasts are composed of an assembly of lines that renders them terrible. But Le Camus, so this theorist, went further by proposing the extension of this idea to the world of inanimate things, propounding the view that a single line, right, can suffice to express the character of any physical object and therefore of any building. And isn't it what we witness along the Yuri Kamome, right? I'm asking the question, does it show this image or does it show something else here? Or you can see that the building does not even need to curve its lips to smile, right? The single line that defines the underside of its eyes suffices to unmistakably evoke raised cheeks and therefore like a smile. And likewise, other buildings in Tokyo similarly smirk, chuckle, snicker, titter, cackle, or guffaw with geometric precision and unbeknownst to us. So all these terms mean that they are laughing. And character theory, as it turns out, also grants buildings a quasi-subject status, which resonates with the Japanese animistic worldview, although not attributing to objects the very capacity to feel. What was important to Le Camus was their potential ability to express feelings. In stressing the Oriental origin of English gardens, he, so Le Camus, noted that, quote, the objects they are composed of, albeit insensible and inanimate, act on the faculties of our soul, end quote. And which in many ways, I think, echoes the principle of the Sakuteiki, allegedly the oldest treatise on garden planning, largely based on the idea of following the requests of the stone, which attributes to mineral matter psychophysical properties best described by the Japanese term ishigokoro, which means basically the mind of the stone. So understandably, the semantic field, the meanings of the term caractère is something that has evolved through time and has expanded to acquire other meanings. From its ancient Greek root, caractère, which meant basically both a tool for marking and also the distinctive mark that this tool leaves. It then evolved from signifying the peculiar traits that define a person to the person itself in 17th century dramaturgy or theater. And then the set of distinctive attributes that typifies an individual, you know, when we talk about somebody of bad character, for example, is the sense that has been eventually retained. So the creation of the popular kyarakutā in post-war Japan, which is very much a very important phenomenon, shares with robotic aesthetics the principle of summation of the body to elementary forms, but does so with very different stylistic means. If much has been written already about the similarities between the characters of the Japanese language and Japanese, urban form in Japan, less has been written about the linkage between Japanese architecture and the anime character, which is this subcultural product which puts a stronger emphasis on the face, right? And whose birth pertains to the same post-war era, which has simultaneously embraced and been fueled by robots. So several aspects point yet to physical affinities between kyarakutā and the ordinary architecture of Tokyo, as evidenced in many of these photographs. Many of these buildings are symmetrical, right? And most akin for its structural ties with the construction industry to what a historian called Louis Mumford called a mega machine. The Japanese corporate architectural practice appears to systematically resort to symmetry as a means to instill the symbolic value of stability and maximize feasibility. So what imbues the buildings that these corporations produce with even more persona, but what fundamentally individuates them is this space that separates each of the city structures, which is its regulated frame from which a sense of theatricality can only ensue. So I'm talking about the space that you can see between each buildings, and something also that is part of the regulation system in Kyoto, right? What we call a schema. So facing the inherently uniform yet dimensionally diverse blocks produced by these corporations, mise en scène by the seemingly chaotic plan of Tokyo, one is reminded of the latent or hidden anthropomorphism, in the words of Michael Fried, found in minimalist sculpture, only enhanced by what he called a unitary character for these buildings. So contrasts of scale and style confer indeed to Tokyo's architecture a certain cuteness, analogous to that of kyarakutā. The determinant characteristics of the cute or the kawaii may have been sought in smallness, but it's arguable that cuteness and large size are not necessarily antinomic in this context. Something large can be cute, right? Many characters of Japanese pop culture are overscaled and derive their cuteness precisely from their juxtaposition to much smaller creatures. And that large things might be designed in a manner that eventually connotes smallness was pointed out by the semiologist Roland Barthes, who said that, quote, if Japanese things appear to us as small, This is not because of their size, it is because of every object, even the freest, the most mobile, appears framed. The notion of miniature does not come from size, but from a sort of precision that the thing uses to delimit itself. End quote. And neither does cuteness have, I think, a specific gender, while theorists of the kawaii have strived to relate its origins to characteristics associated with femininity. The evolution of the mascot character represents that the mascot characters represent, I think, complicate any such association. Consider, for example, the television broadcasting company NHK's famous mascot Domo, for instance, whose face featuring prominently a large, squarish, and sharp-toothed mouth basically occupies nearly the entirety of its monolithic body. So it's something undoubtedly cute, right? But it barely evokes anything feminine. The more common denominator of the cuteness of kyarakutā can rather be seen in the very emphasis their design puts on the face, and more specifically on the eyes and the mouth over the rest of the body, and the transfer of these human features into a thing. This distortion of facial proportions and conformation to elementary geometric shapes brings to mind a process of incorporation. Body and head fuse with each other, subsuming and centralizing all individual parts into capital. The kyarakutā embodies thus a form of somatization of the face, whereby the body's multiple members invade and become a single artificial countenance, in turn seeking to reattach a face to an acephalous structure. So here I'm talking about the corporations, right? So unsurprisingly, the mascot character, which is the kyarakutā par excellence, has grown to become the sign that visually defines corporate identity in Japan, to such an extent that landmark buildings in Tokyo have increasingly been marketed in association with bespoke characters, such as Toranomon, which is based on the famous Doraemon manga character, which was created specifically for the Toranomon Hills complex, completed in 2014, or Sora Kara-chan, designed for the Tokyo Skytree Tower, which was completed in 2012. All right, so giant building corporations in Japan are themselves referred to by the name of Zenekon, a neologism which results from the contraction of the first syllables of general and contractor, right? Zenekon, general contractor, in which I think wittingly or not associates the cuteness of the character to the world of construction. No wonder the products of these companies end up looking like Hello Kitties. And this not only confirms that business friendliness and buffoonery go hand in hand, but suggests that they become unconsciously one and the same thing in the real space of Tokyo. Pleasure in nonsense, Sigmund Freud taught us, is at the core of the joke and its social function, and the kyarakutā fulfills this function. And Tokyo provides a stage for the physical and the oniric to collide. If the processes of condensation and displacement are fundamental to both the formation of jokes and dream work, according to Freud, these processes are obviously at stake in the mascot character's distorted body image, and few other cities provide a better space for them to take place. Within a culture that tends to merge different types of visual media and flatten them into a composite mental image, a phenomenon brought to an extreme within the cityscape of Tokyo, the visual juxtaposition of built and unbuilt artifacts can, and in fact appears to be intended to, result in a fusion between character and architecture. And this synthesis seems even more salient in another subcategory of kyarakutā, which is the Gundam, a building-sized robot character designed as a martial suit whose head can be inhabited by a human being, right? So what makes this comparison more acute in the context of Tokyo is, I think, the extremely small size of living units, in a sense where the membrane the membrane that separates the inside from the inside, the outside of its dwellings, of the dwellings of Tokyo, gets so close to the human body that the building tends to become some sort of second skin for its occupant, not unlike what the Gundam again represents to its pilot. A similarity even more salient if one considers that Tokyo buildings are periodically called to move, right, for seismic reasons. Suppose you have the same problem here in Kyoto. So somewhat logically, the very aesthetics of the Gundam has constituted a territory of inspiration for architects in Japan. Post-war manga culture and robot-based television series such as Astro Boy, or what's the name? I think it's called Mighty Atomo in Japanese. So this reportedly had a profound impact on the generation of Japanese architects coming of age around the end of the 20th century. So while at first glance, the Gundam might appear as the morphological antithesis, like the opposite in a sense of a mascot, for its emphasis on defensiveness, right? It's a warrior, it's a martial suit. I think that it in fact performs a very similar face-body conflation, merging within its own stylistic means. If the sheer size of the Gundam and its shell function further invite parallels with architecture, I think that the oversizing of its limbs, its body, right, and the weapon-like complexification of their shape results in a physique wherein the face is minimized to such an extent that it becomes indiscernible, eventually succumbing to a comparable form of somatic absorption. So on the one hand, you have the body that becomes the face, right? And on the other, with the Gundam, the face becomes the body, literally illustrating the two associated processes of capitalization and incorporation. And the inventor of the term robot was a Czech person called Josef Čapek. And he was an early advocate of what has controversially been termed primitivism in 20th century art. And Josef Čapek argued that the idiomatic proportions of traditional African sculpture, wherein he said the heads are excessively large and much attention is paid to the eyes, that's his own terms, did not in fact result from the technical shortcomings of its creators, but stemmed instead from an intention to make a man rather than to merely depict one. For Čapek, the simplification of physical features into geometric shapes was essential in this process. In building, quote, he said that building the figure of a person from cubes and arches results in something more fundamental, more mysterious, and eventually more alive, which he then associated with the idea of divine creation. So I think that in light of Čapek's reflections, it is tempting to see in the recurrence of schematic face-like patterns, such as these ones entrenched in the buildings of what is arguably the most modernized city on earth, right, Tokyo, some sort of a resurgence of the primitive within the technological, which points back, I think, to the polysemy of character, its different meanings. And I think that intimations of this phenomenon can be found in the comparisons drawn between the popular Yulukyala, a term coined to designate the various mascot characters that represent the cities and regions of Japan, and the ancient Shinto proclivity to turn a myriad of gods believed to reside in any animate and inanimate objects in nature into characters with specific names and personalities. Here I'm talking about the famous yokai. And this harks back to some sort of animist past that Japanese culture never fully parted from. And in similar panpsychist terms, the Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori attributed Buddhic character to the robot for, as he said, that which controls and that which is controlled are both manifestation of the Buddha nature, end quote. And notably, Mori's reflection led him to relate the functioning of a corporate firm to that of a machine. So I think that here we can again consider the ambivalent etymological root of character, which, as you may remember, it tends to equate the sign to the sign that it produces, right? It's both the machine and what it produces in a way that it in a sense embodies the complex transfer of will that Mori invoked. And it suggests, I think, the potentiality for sophisticated instruments, such as robots, to likewise create objects in their own likeness. If progress means accrued autonomy, what would prevent the machine from resorting to its own preference for the primitive? And as a conclusion, I said that as the population of Japan inexorably shrinks, the country's largely automated building sector is alive and well, laughing at the sight of Tokyoids turning into Tokyoids. All right, so that was it for my first chapter. I'm going to jump to pain. All right, pain starts with a painful quote, an epigraph from a monk that visited Japan back in the 16th century from Spain, if I'm correct, called Louis Freud, who wrote a number of comparisons that were very simplified and very drastic between what he saw in Europe and what he saw in Japan. He said that among us, servants are reprimanded and serfs are punished by whipping. In Japan, the reprimand and punishment is beheading, so cutting the head. It's something very radical. So I'm going to start. Armed with 29 sets of facial muscles, a sophisticated robot designed for Expo 70 in Osaka, so not too far, was programmed to raise its lips into a human-like realistic smile. But by drastically slowing down the speed of the mechanism, the green appeared surprisingly creepy. For the roboticist Masahiro Mori, so again, the same person I was talking about before, this enigmatic vision served to illustrate the importance of movement in the appearance of robots, and also to stress how it relates to our potential revulsion towards anthropomorphism in man-made objects. And he said that because of a variation in movement, as something that has come to appear close to human, like a robot, a puppet, or a prosthetic hand, could easily tumble down into what he termed the uncanny valley, which is a perceptual gray area wherein what has been attempted to be realistic no longer brings about a feeling of empathy, but an eerie sensation more akin to horror. And Mori's concluding advocacy for only a moderate degree of human likeness in robot design, I think calls for a distinction between the anthropomorphism that he referred to, and that might be really spooky, right? And also a robot likeness proper vis-a-vis what we can call mobility. So robots, unlike buildings, are designed to move, right? Yet we are also able to identify the robotic. We are able to tell what is a robot even in inanimate structure, right? The robot doesn't need to move in order for us to recognize it as such. And I think that the very suggestion of a capacity to move appears to be of primary importance to robotic aesthetics, as robotic components only need to be combined in a way that allows for merely potential movement in order to be recognized as such. Their implied displacement patterns condition their appearance through an articulation of rigid and rotary, that is basically straight and circular parts, a transcription of the human body into zeros and ones, which obviously is not without reminding the binary code of software. So because robotic aesthetics results from this excision and reconstitution of initially organic wholes out of artificial and idealized functional parts, I think that it is essentially an aesthetic of dismemberment. If robots are certainly not programmed to suffer, the processes at work in their conception involve a high degree of symbolic violence, which, insofar as the perception of robotic form depends on empathy, if we follow Mori, could reflect a profound embedded pain. And this aesthetic seems to pervade and rely upon the internal logic of the robot's dissociated elements. The robotic arm, for example, is already ideologically severed from the body, right? And then it's made of an array of items, cogs, wheels, shafts, pistons, pulleys, which are themselves detachable and express in themselves their removability through their form, in turn influencing the appearance of the device and its movements. So one could then posit that robotic form embodies a three-step process which is diffusely expressed in its morphology. One is dismemberment of the human body as a referent. Two is idealization of the dissected parts into components. And three is reassembly of these components into a mechanical entity. And principles at play in the origins of Japanese aesthetics seem to resonate with this internal logic. The Japanese philosopher Masao Kusanagi traced the concept of fragmentariness back to medieval poetry and identified it as the aesthetic essence of Japanese artistic practice. Quoting the Buddhist poet-monk Shinkei's 15th century assertion that you find mystery and depth where things are left to be said, Kusanagi highlighted formal similarities with the unfinished nature of certain Renaissance artworks, which entice the response of the aesthetic subject. And he also posited that the profundity and richness of artworks might paradoxically be proportional to the extent of their fragmentation. Like in a sense that he's saying that the less finished an artwork is, in a sense that the more we respond to it. So not only does the notion of fragmentariness that Kusanagi referred to directly relate to the dissected aspects of the robot that I mentioned before, but the central role he assigned to the viewer in the completion of the artwork recalls the aforementioned tendency to either project ourselves as subjects into the work, like that's what Molly said, right? Or to reject it altogether as an object. And the robotic as an aesthetic category of its own reflect, I think, this impossible whole, an inherently unfinished, or rather unfinishable project whose geometry-sized parts are only assembled by human empathy. But even deeper relations between the fragmentariness embedded in robotic aesthetics and the Japanese ethos can be found in the form and structure of the Japanese language itself. If this notion is most obviously expressed in Japanese text through the simultaneous presence of three writing systems, as we know, right? Kanji, hiragana, and katakana. The latter, katakana, deserves, I think, particular attention in this particular respect. While often associated or regarded as negligible for its apparent simplicity and restricted contemporary use, katakana has played a fundamental role in the development of both ancient and modern Japan. Most revelatory not only of the functioning of the Japanese mind, I think, but of its relationship with other cultures, katakana also embodies the concept of fragmentariness more than the other scripts of the Japanese language for several reasons, which I'm going to go through. Research in the history of Japanese linguistics has shown that the use of katakana was formalized around the year 1000, so a long time ago, and that many of the script's signs have barely changed since. The development of kana scripts, so hiragana and katakana, which reportedly happened in the 9th century in Japan, followed an emancipation from the influence of Chinese culture, which was particularly predominant in the 7th and 8th century. So I'm talking about the Heian era, right, that had a lot to do with Kyoto, in fact. So both syllabaries stem from the, so again, like hiragana and katakana, stem from the intention to palliate, to go beyond the difficulty of translating Japanese. Okay. To palliate the discrepancy between the way the language was written and the way it was spoken, as the pronunciation of Chinese characters in Japanese evolved in such a way that they eventually markedly differed from their original reading. So the early stages of formation of katakana script, katakana script, are more clearly known, in fact, than those of hiragana. The former, so katakana, is said to stem from the diacritical marks, so basically small annotations used by priests as an aid to translate Buddhist writings in the Heian period, so 794-1192. And this results from a process of simplification referred to as a technique of isolation by linguists, where one part of the character has been excised from the corpus of an original and inherently figurative Chinese ideogram. Then it's been rendered abstract as what is called a phonological syllabogram. So consider, for example, how the katakana sign mu is essentially a beheading of the Chinese character mo, or how he is cut from the right side of the body of B in Chinese, or how fu results from the dissection of the upper left part of bu in Chinese. So what has followed this fragmentation process is one of geometric disambiguation, wherein nearly straight lines have been further straightened, as you can see, right, into undeviating segments, and whimsical curves have been simplified into strictly circular arcs, recalling not only the fractional physics of the robotic device, but also its constitutive rods and rotors that I was talking about before. And as unsurprisingly, the word kata, used as a prefix in katakana, means a fragment or part. And the bluntness of that is expressed in katakana, I think, clearly contrasts with the formal fluidity of hiragana, which is thought to have evolved, if at all, in some cases, from what is called cursivized Chinese characters. Compare, for instance, how the katakana sign la differs from its hiragana counterpart, or na as well. So hiragana, which was referred to during the Heian period as onnade, or literally women's hand, was mainly used by women who were reportedly prohibited from studying Chinese, and it was used for writing specifically literature. And it came to be mainly used for aesthetic purposes in what the linguist Yaeko Sato Habain described as, quote, a leisurely aristocratic environment, end quote, as opposed to the more austere and utilitarian use of katakana, developed for the sake of speed by these clergymen, these monks that were trying to translate this Buddhist text. So this, I think we find this in the functionality of katakana, again, the notion of residual aesthetic, which typifies robotics, by adhering to a strict economy of means and disregarding beauty as an end in itself. The script of the katakana, which is more a codification process than the type of calligraphy, eventually produced an even more characteristic stylistic entity. But the parallel between katakana and robotic aesthetic goes beyond the sheer appearance of the script. The beginning of the Meiji era, so 1868, 1912, marked by the opening of Japan to foreign influence, as you know. So the rise of reforms for the reduction, if not the abolition, of kanji character use, giving an authoritative place to katakana, notably as a means to transcribe and adopt words of and concepts of foreign origin, right, and predominantly European, which have been referred to as gairaigo, which means basically imported languages. You know. And this growing usage was later formalized by official guidelines, which were ratified after World War II, and systematizing basically transcription rules so as to avoid the multiple possible spellings of foreign words that the relatively narrow range of katakana phonograms allows. And the process involved in the conversion of a loan word into katakana indeed called for what I would call properly decisive conventions. So the script consists in its modern state of 46 syllabograms. So again, that's what I'm referring to, which are mainly combinations of two phonemes, so corresponding, for example, to a consonant phoneme by a vowel, such as kakikukeko in the case of the sound k, and reflecting, but also thoroughly restricting the range of sounds afforded by the Japanese language to a very limited set. So when a word is imported, its closest pronunciation to the donor language is first dissected into a set of syllables pronounceable in Japanese, then written using the conventional modules of katakana, which are basically precast, idealized syllabogram, which are then reassembled into a substantive body. Thus, we find again, as you can hear, like within the confines of the structure of the Japanese language, the aesthetic of dismemberment inherent to robotic form, involving a similar three-step process of dissection, one, of the imported word's body, two, idealization of the dissected parts, and three, reassembly into a mechanistic vocabulary, embodying likewise a great deal of pain. So the Japanese term for modernism, for example, transcribed in katakana as modernizumu, might suffice to illustrate this principle of compartmentalization. It also reflects the indifference of the katakana mechanism to the inherent etymological structure of the loanword. The term modernism no longer has 3 syllables, but 5, and both its Latin root, modus, and superlative construction have been erased in the dismember process. Moving through the assembly line of katakana codification, the foreign word ceases to be a cultural construct and becomes the product of a mechanistic operation that is insensitive to the organic structure the term has acquired over time. That katakana transcription systematically attempts to be as truthful as possible to the pronunciation of the word in the donor language, producing words that are often incomprehensible to the non-Japanese whose language has been borrowed, can be further regarded as an embodiment of both the cultural carefulness and the rational brutality of the Japanese mind. Furthermore, the emphasis the script puts on the process of dissection can be considered in relation to the importance of the action of cutting in Japanese culture at large, found in such varied aspects as the practice of ikizukuri in local cuisine, wherein animals are vivisected to be eaten raw, or the tolerance for scenes of dismemberment in samurai movies, or historical accounts of systematic beheadings, such as in the epigraphs of, as described in the epigraphs of Louis Freus, which are all linked to the traditional focus on crafting the sharpest cutlery, right? This is not my photograph. To put this there to illustrate my point. I'm almost done. The katakana script, and now representing the fastest growing and most creative part of the Japanese language, encapsulates a process of inclusion of modernity into a separate category of things Japanese, loanwords are not internalized along with their etymological and semantic structure, but reconfigured according to a local code. For this reason, katakana might be considered the cultural agent which, by divesting foreign concepts of their historical burden, or the historical burden of their original meanings, right, accelerated the process of adoption of Western technologies. The cult of standardization in early modernist architecture directly recalls the modularization of the katakana script into morphemes of equal length and value. The pre-existence of this latter in Japan as this procedural technique finds itself registered in the modularity, as we can see, of the post and beam construction system, and also the tatami-mat measurement system of traditional Japanese architecture, which have undoubtedly facilitated the fast adoption, or rather the adaptation of Euro-American modernist design ideology. The year following the publication of his celebrated Architecture Without Architects, Bernard Rudowski presented an acute critique of Japanese culture at large in his book called The Kimono Mind of 1965, which I would encourage you to read. But in this book, he also lucidly conceded that, quote, centuries before we even thought of standardization, prefabrication, and mobility as architectural possibilities, the Japanese applied them to their houses as a matter of course. So it should follow from what I've just said that because it relates so profoundly to both the oldest and most modern formal expressions of the Japanese linguistic identity, katakana can be regarded not only as very specifically Japanese, but also as what defines the Japanese ethos, representing the equally destructive and creative prism through which foreign influence and technology have been apprehended and interpreted. The fact that katakana also tends to visually dominate the billboard landscape of urban Japan should, I think, be regarded as a mere superficial manifestation of its integration into design culture, for the way the functioning of this script affects Japanese artifacts as a whole goes much deeper, diffusely infiltrating every aspect of built form through its morphological structure. So much so that if one considers the robotic aesthetic embedded in these pervasive linguistic contraptions, katakana, one can posit that all modern Japanese architecture is in essence robotic. Thank you.
So thank you for fascinating talk. It was profound and frivolous at the same time. Very nice balance. I wonder if, before we ask the audience if they have any questions, I wonder if you have a personal definition of robot.
Are you talking to me or to them? To you. Okay. Robot, I think what we mean by robot is a sort of mimicking of the human form, but with artificial means. I think that's what we mean by that. That's why, in a sense, it's related to. I try to make this comparison with art, and try to say it's not so different in a sense to, I mean, maybe the visual arts, because it comes back so often to the depiction of the human figure. In a sense, these are maybe two branches of the same project.
So you brought in a lot of fairly early architectural theory and artistic references. The word robot, as far as I know, was invented in the year 1920. It comes from the Czech word that means repetitive labor. So a robot was an automaton with some kind of independence that could perform a task for you. So how is it that you were able to bring in references prior to 1920 as being some robotic?
Thanks for this question. Like, I think that in a sense that the whole point of writing this first chapter was to precisely show that there was a sort of image of the robot that emerged in architectural theory a long time before the birth of robotics as a modern science. So in a sense, I'm trying to show that that robotic aesthetics emerge from this particular body of theory, and that in a sense that the world of robotics belongs in a sense to architecture. And that came from my observation of, again, like this insertion of robots within the territory of architecture, within the architecture schools. So in a sense, it's a way to say, look, there's probably not so much point in a sense inserting robots into architecture, because it's more like a robotics that has to do with architecture in the first place. This image of the robot, I see it emerging through, let's say, the first point of departure is like through Villard-de-Honcourt, which is this medieval lodge builder that basically drew a number of diagrams, and in many of these treatises that I studied, either like medieval ones or ones from the Renaissance, very much you can see that the architects or the theorists that produce these treatises were interested in not only coming up with a number of techniques or design methods to design buildings, they were also very much interested in designing automata. There was the culture, I would say, of robotics and the culture of designing buildings are not so far away from each other. It's probably the distinction between these two fields of inquiry possibly happens later on. And again, like we were saying something very similar at one particular point. So stressing in a sense that these have evolved into two different fields and they can be thought of as the same.
I wonder if the issue of aesthetics is important. You're very careful in the title of the book to say robotic aesthetics rather than robots. And all of your work is on the issue of the face. And prior to the emergence of the idea of a robot at all, we see abstract faces in buildings, sometimes human faces, sometimes some of your examples look like insects or animals. And naturally, being buildings, there's a kind of geometric abstraction simply because they're made of bricks or metal panels and so on and so forth. So how would you make any kind of distinction between robotic aesthetic and simply the abstraction of a face?
That's an interesting question, but again, like referring to my the first chapter that I wrote, I think I see the robotic aesthetic emerging from the desire to impose a specific order onto the face. And what I try to grasp is the particular design methodologies that have been applied, obviously, to the world of architecture, the means of design buildings through lines, right? Through a way of assembling lines, trying to kind of grasp them in these very portraits. So they are, in a sense, robotic because they are reinterpretations. They are idealizations of the human face. And I think that's the connection, I would say. Like a face isn't like a real face, one that is not idealized. It's not something that is drawn by lines, right? So it's only as architects we draw lines and to delineate one part from another. Obviously, very often we draw straight lines as architects, right? It's more economical. And therefore, when these architects redraw these lines over faces, when they try to idealize, or when they did before, the face appeared as more robotic because these lines have been simplified.
Yes, I guess it's drawing lines as the architect or designer, but also the fact of modules and panels
as well,
and frames that are needed to build.
Yes. That's right.
So would it be more accurate to say this is about an image of robots taken from popular culture? We see these kinds of faces, of course, in Japanese toys from the 1950s, which are based on kind of robot imagery, science fiction, and so forth. But you would never see a face on any of the robots being used in architecture schools right now.
No, yes, that's a good point. That would be interesting to actually witness. But I think that there's a whole political dimension to that. I mean, it's something that I tackle in another chapter. The fact that the face has been excised from the body of the robot is also something that is highly problematic, because we tend to think of the arm as something that is not connected to the human being, in the sense that the workforce is being replaced by things that have no face. This is highly problematic from an ethical point of view, I think, something that I tackle elsewhere. But yes, this connection, I understand that, you know, there's a stretch between the robotic arm, which has a certain degree, which embodies a certain degree of figuration still, right? It's a robotic arm, right? We're talking about something that looks like a human to a certain extent, and also in terms of what it performs. There's a stretch between this and the robotic face that you might see in a toy robot, right? Which looks a bit more funny, but that does precisely to remind that I think we're talking about the same thing eventually. I mean, in the sense that these two things are still called the same. They're still referred to as a robot in both cases. So it's in a way a way to recall that there's such a similarity in terms of the terminology that we use. Just I think that should be sufficient in a sense, but yeah, not so many people have proposed such a comparison.
Sure. Well, I mean, it seems to be the comparison between looking like a robot and behaving like a robot. Obviously, a robot arm that doesn't look anything like a human being, robotic things. Face might remind you of toys or science fiction movies, but doesn't actually do anything robotic. Would that be fair?
Yeah, you can say that. But I think that again, the appearance of the robot as it appears in architecture schools, this kind of robotic arms, like the one I first showed at the beginning of my lecture, embody also a certain degree of aesthetic that comes along with what it performs. You know, like there's a certain degree of how can I say accuracy, a certain degree of economy of means in the robotic arms, which is appealing, I think, to architects precisely because it corresponds to certain dogma that certain architectural dogma that belong to very much to the field of architecture. I'm thinking about the kind of fitness for purpose, for example, the kind of idea of the flexible program, even the texture itself of the robot is something that it talks to the history of architecture and of architectural dogmas. I mean, from Alberti to Gropius, you have a body of theory that advocates not only a form of organicism, that's very obvious, but the idea of fitness for purpose, the fact that no part of the building should be superfluous, right? And this is very much what we see when we look at a robot in the context of an architecture school. So I think we're facing something that may be a bit dangerous in the sense that, in a sense, the robots tend to look better than whatever we produce with them. They are very finely designed artifacts which fascinate architects, yet this is obviously not our task, right, to design robots, unless we become like a completely different type of school. So I'm trying to highlight also this synergy, this bit of a nonsense as well.
Yeah, well, there's some humor, of course, in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering if in your book, and if you think also, because I thought that you talk about the face of the architecture, about robotic, will be about the AC that we can see, for example, in Japan, or the washing machine, or everything like that. and I didn't know that it was about the face. I mean, the human face. And I was wondering if you think that robotic face of architecture could be also how it show about the AC or the facade.
Yeah, it's a very easy question to answer. The answer is yes. And there is a number of images in the book that actually try to aestheticize, in a sense, to include some of the AC units, which is really something that the architects don't want to show, right? Yeah. This is the last thing architects want to show. So something that again, like described in one part of the book, is that as part of these pictures, as part of this series of pictures, I was trying, if there's any kind of rule that I followed, to try to look at elements that usually architects tend to shun, such as ventilation shaft, spotlights, dust, many small infrastructural things that usually is the last thing that architects want to see in their projects. I was trying to precisely show that these, when combined with other elements, can create artistically relevant compositions. So there's very much part of it, and in a sense, it's a book that, I mean, through its there are several aspects, but through its photographic series, try to, in a sense, celebrate this kind of experimental mixes between architecture and infrastructure that makes Tokyo very so particular. There's no other places in the world that I know of where, first of all, the infrastructure is so visible, and also where that's a real like desire to mix both the building and the infrastructure. So it's a kind of celebration of that instance.
Do you actually have another kind of set of rules or parameters when you search for the buildings itself?
That's a good question. I think I didn't want it to be too obvious. That's one part. I think it's not too difficult to find a building that has just like two windows on top of like a larger one at the bottom, something that looks like a face, so I wanted also them not to be boring, so that they don't look too much like each other from one to the next. So yeah, if you put just these small rules together, already that complicates a lot, right? So going outside with a camera, I had to look at this. Also, I wanted to have a good mix between pictures that would be taken at night, where the lighting of the building plays a part in revealing precisely the robotic aesthetic of the building, which is not something, again, that is not very emphasized in architectural photography. We like to show buildings like in broad daylight, or usually in the morning or something like that. So yeah, I wanted to have these sort of things, and again, like try to include as many to include as much diversity in terms of the kind of infrastructural components that you just described, such as, for example, air conditioning units. If I took one with air conditioning, I don't want to have to have 10, next to each other that are exactly the same. I was not interested in bringing things together by just similarity in terms of the kind of components of the composition, but much to put them in families in terms of their expression, in order to make this parallel with the older physiognomical treatises. I think it's more interesting to me.
There's an online question from Nicholas Ettle. Thanks for the brilliant lecture. I'm wondering if you could share more insights to your observational methodology, especially your strategy on how you're walking to find these spaces in Tokyo.
Good question as well. Because you want to partake in, you want to start a similar venture, like that's a good one. I think that going out a lot is important, and in Tokyo is something that you can forget about easily because many people take the subway. It has the most convenient subway system that I know of. And when you take the subway, you don't get to see much architecture. I don't get to see many buildings. So my advice is, I mean, what I did when I was in Tokyo is ride a bicycle a lot, so that I could see bicycle at the speed of a bicycle. You can still see many buildings, but let's say if you're in a car, it's possibly more complicated, I think. So yeah, I think that walking is a good thing as well, but you probably don't see as many buildings as that. But in terms of observational methodology, I would say, it's a complicated term, observational methodology. I think that what I noticed is that many of these buildings did not reveal themselves to me that easily. Many of them appeared at moments where I was not necessarily paying attention, or I didn't have my camera. So, I had to really come back many times to shoot pictures and I think that Tokyo is a very specific city because its beauty does not reveal itself so easily. You discover it bit by bit. You get lost in some small street, and then you bump into things that are really interesting. It's not a postcard city like let's say Paris or New York, where you know that you're in front of a monument. You have to take a picture, in a sense, and Tokyo's beauty, as you probably noticed, right? I'm assuming you've all been to Tokyo. Something that you discover bit by bit, and not only looking at completely unknown buildings like the ones I was looking for, even though I understand that some of them are known, but sometimes, as you probably noticed, you bump into a very, known architectural masterpieces, even though you didn't know they were there. I remember bumping into the embassy of Kuwait by Tongye, walking along the street, and what a discovery. It felt more like precisely because I was not expecting it to be there at that particular moment. It just made the discovery way more interesting to me. So yeah, my methodology would be more like go out there and walk as much as possible. Look around. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Talking very much. And as when the time when you were presenting trend, I keep notice that the wall behind is like a robotic.
The wall behind the robotic. In what sense? Because of these two oculi. You're right. Then yeah.
So I keep notice that, and I found that once you have two dots and a line, you have a robotic.
That's yeah.
So
you could say that.
How can you tell if that is formed like by purpose or like by coincidence? That's my question.
Yes, very much. I was looking for things that were not intentional. So it's again like a fairly easy question to answer. I think that there's a number of examples, especially in Japanese architecture, where architects clearly tried to design things that look like robots. Right? I think that's a famous example in Kyoto. Is this in Kyoto? Yeah, is there? Okay. What's the name of the architect again? Okay. Yamashita. So there's also the Jumsai, the architect in Thailand, right? That designed this robot building, the Bank of Asia. I respect these buildings, but these are things that are left aside. I was more interested in kind of searching for things that are almost intentional, or where the border between intentional and unintentional is kind of blurred, in order to again like reveal, in a sense, like the robotic unconscious of Tokyo, like to look at. I think that what hasn't been intended, in a sense, possibly more revealing of the actual cityscape of Tokyo. this thing. And again, like I was not interested in writing a book about famous architects in Tokyo or in Japan. Like some people do it very well already. But yeah, I was looking at my point was to look at unknown buildings. So I know that in some parts, like look, for example, I showed the Tocho by Kenzo Tonge, but again, like I'm looking at the parts of the buildings that have been interpreted by myself or framed as figurative, but the architect obviously did not think of it as anything like that, right? I mean, I'm assuming, knowing a bit of Tange, I don't think that's what he meant. Okay. And the intentionality comes from me, like looking at these things. And again, I talk a bit about it in the book, about the psychology and the fact that our brains are wired to perceive faces where there is a known. This is a typical a human faculty, a human trait that we almost cannot fight against.
So what do you think is so special about Japanese architecture, Japanese architects that's inspired with their architecture and robots other different countries? Why is it just Japan or Japanese architecture?
Which countries in particular are you thinking about?
Maybe if you say like in this, we're talking like in which they're good to the English industry as well. But why is it just Japan? We're talking about the stuff of architecture.
Yeah, when you say that, the first thing that comes to my mind is the Astro Boy. The fact that like animation and robotics was something that was intimately like brought together, like as in the fact that this is a little boy, but also he has a body. There's a body of a robot. Something that was very much part of the psyche of post-war Japan, like the possibility of engineering a human being. When I talk about it again, like in make this comparison of Astro Boy to a drawing by Le Corbusier, like I invite you to read this part. But I think that the anime industry was much more developed like in Japan. I mean, growing up in France, like we saw many more animation from Japan, I think, and from the US as far as I know. It's really a typical local character or like produce product, cultural product. But coming back to the robotics, I think it's true that and I read a bit about that. I wrote a bit about that as well. That the industrial robots that were developed or that were used in Japanese factories from the 1960s to up to now, they were imported at the very beginning from America. So it's not something that emerged directly from Japan, but there's a culture of robotics, of like the idea of the robot that predates this insertion of the industrial robot into Japan. So there was already some kind of terrain, in a sense, like that was welcoming this kind of import. They saw something in the industrial robot, I think, that the Americans hadn't seen. I might be wrong, but that's my interpretation.
Can I ask, there's obviously some manipulation done to your photos. You can see the verticals are vertical and the horizontals are horizontal, and I guess you've adjusted the contrast. Did you use any Photoshop to enhance how face-like they were?
That's a good question. No, but I did like make the edges straight, as you just mentioned, right? Which is a very strong characteristic of architectural photography. Usually we strive for that, but we don't strive so much for flatness. So I was trying to do something more like the Düsseldorf school, right? Bert and Ila Becher, that I was trying to do something a bit more similar to that, even though I discovered their work actually after I started this this study, but the idea was really to show the face. So, and since again, like I'm talking about robotic faces, was really important for me that it's either straight or circular, and that it obeys to this particular framework. But yeah, other than that, yeah, the contrast obviously has been changed. What I can see also is that many of these pictures were very difficult to shoot for me because I am not a photographer. You can see that, yeah, my first book has little to do with that, right? I was drawing a lot. And since I actually finished this book, I completely stopped shooting photographs. I think it's too difficult. But what I want to say is that many of these were hard to shoot in the sense that the camera was too close to the building itself, to the subject that I was photographing. So I had to shoot often to shoot the building in several parts and bring them together into a composite whole that would look like as if, you know, the picture had been taken like this from the start. I don't know if there are tools, like photographic tools, that can allow you to do that all at once like that, but yeah, that could have been useful because, yeah, I spent quite some time putting all this together.
It's true, in Tokyo, it's very hard to step back far enough to get the full image that you want to take.
Yes.
Any other questions while we're here? Okay, so I think we're done.